10 American Philosophers and Why You Should Know Them. Jonathan Edwards, 1703–1758. Jonathan Edwards was a Calvinist minister who was part of the Great Awakening and preached a revivalist movement. He focused less on ritual but more on personal experience. In his essay Freedom of the Will, John Edwards argues that God's supreme sovereignty, his foreknowledge and the requirement for events to have causes prevents man from having a lot of free will. He toured extensively at the height of the movement, giving sermons on the grace of God and personal religious involvement. Shortly before his death he replaced his grandson Aaron Burr as president of Princeton University. Thomas Paine, 1737–1809. He was a philosopher, an unreliable soldier and author of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine, who was a radical thinker behind the American Revolution, called for independence via common sense in 1776. He did this around 3 years before any other person in her support. He advocated for the rights of people to rule themselves. After the American Revolution, Lafayette served in France and was instrumental in the drafting of France's first constitution, though he didn't speak French. He published the book Agrarian Justice and argued for a basic income. He also defended the French Revolution against Burke in his book The Rights of Man, which introduced ideas about pension system to Western thoughts. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882. One of the greatest transcendentalist philosophers, Emerson was also a deeply influential author. At first he worked as a minister, but left the pulpit after his wife died. His writing revolves around many topics and themes, such as education, self-improvement, nature, and the dignity of the ordinary person. He gifted Thoreau with a large area of his land that he owned in Massachusetts, and it was used to house Walden. One should not forget that Nietzsche was an influence, as shown in this overview. He was also the godfather to our next entry. William James, 1842–1910. A physician, psychologist and philosopher, James is a pragmatic thinker who contributed to topics like education and metaphysics. His book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, A Study in Human Nature, foreshadowed his pragmatic philosophy. The author of this text argues that religious experiences can be human experiences and examines possible explanations for mystical events. His Principles of Psychology was immensely popular in early American psychology, and it was highly influential in shaping the progress of psychology in the 20th century. After taking into account citations, James is considered one of the most influential psychologists of that time. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1860–1935. The feminist philosopher, social reformer and author who wrote on the problems of women unable to reach their full potential, emphasizing the need for change and equality. In her book Women and Economics, Marilyn Waring argues that women work just as hard as men do, but have been marginalized into domestic roles. Taylor also said that attaining the vote would not be enough. Her novel, aptly titled Herland, envisions a world without men, where women are freed of domestic work and restrictive gender roles. As such, they've been able to establish an ideal society. According to Wikipedia, The Yellow Wallpaper is a short story written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1892. It is about a woman who undergoes physical and mental deterioration after being prescribed rest, but instead of getting better, she gets worse. This was written by a woman who had postpartum psychosis but was told her only choice was the rest cure and that the doctor didn't think her condition would last. She mailed him a copy of this when she finally recovered in hopes he would change his mind about the inefficacy of his treatment. John Dewey, 1859–1952. John Dewey is a famous philosopher, psychologist and founder of the highly successful experimental school. As a part of his theories on progressive education, he founded the laboratory schools. With this, students were encouraged to explore and learn by doing. One of the best ways to learn is through education, which John Dewey called learning how to live. He developed methods for interactive learning and a well-rounded curriculum. problem-based learning and experimental learning have large debts to his thought, as he viewed education as the means for learning how to live. W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868–1963. A sociologist, historian, author, activist, and the first African American to receive a Ph.D. from Harvard University, Du Bois was very busy. Many of his writings are considered seminal texts, especially The Philadelphian Negro and The Souls of Black Folk. His writing was groundbreaking at the time in highlighting racism as the motive for poor living conditions of blacks. His essay collection, The Souls of Black Folk, examines black life in America. It focuses especially on the feeling of alienation and experiences of living in a society as viewed through this prism. This idea is known as double consciousness, and it has had an influence on civil rights leaders all over the world. This book is about the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, and racial politics in America. It also explores Booker T. Washington's contribution to society as a leader and activist. His writing was not only restricted to one subject, he also helped found the NAACP and was a leader in the fight for social justice. Martin Luther King, 1929–1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as the face of the civil rights movement, but in his free time he also focused on other things, mainly civil rights-related topics. He would often write long essays on controversial topics, and his writing was often direct and provocative. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. explains that the right to protest a government's injustice belongs to the governed and points out that people should have a moral obligation to do so. Martin Luther King Jr. analyzed the civil rights movement's tactics and argued for the idea of universal basic income. He was first a minister and would often return to religion for inspiration. He wrote his doctoral thesis on how religious leaders view God differently, borrowing material from different sources. In his sermons, many of which were published, he expressed support for holding absolute moral laws, the importance of exemplifying Christ-like words, and warned against living for material desires. Robert Nozick, 1938–2002. Descartes is famous for his work on philosophy, including ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. He was a Harvard professor with an unusual writing style and impressive good looks. He is perhaps most famous for his single venture into political philosophy, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In this book, he argues for a minimalist state against both anarcho-capitalism and socialism. In that book he also builds two important arguments against utilitarianism, the virtual reality argument and the utility monster problem. He is currently working on a book called Philosophical Explanations that examines ideas of knowledge and the method of basing large systems of thought on axioms, comparing them to building a house by piling bricks directly onto one another. John Rawls, 1921–2002. A political philosopher out of Harvard who is often considered the greatest of the 20th century. His masterpiece, A Theory of Justice, introduced the idea of justice as fairness and has influenced governments on an international scale. Rawls talks about the limits of legitimate state power and how to maintain democracy and political liberalism. He argues that it is important to ensure stability among all the different factions instead of letting one group win. Though he avoided the public spotlight, John Rawls was a regular contributor to presidential administration Bill Clinton. It was his idea that led to one of Harvard's famous philosophers, Robert Nozick, writing an influential anti-capitalist response to social liberalism. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and watch the video on the screen.